Okay, welcome back. So today we're going through May-June 2023, question paper 11. So we start at the bottom. Just to be aware, Cambridge made a couple of mistakes with this paper. Surprise, surprise. Question 30 and question 22 have actually been removed from the paper. They didn't give a reasoning, but I'm assuming it's because they referenced the Marshall learner condition, which was actually moved from AS to A level with the new syllabus changes. So just to be aware, Marshall learner is referenced in both of them. It's now an A level topic. So we start from question 29. Country experiences a fall in the value of exports and an increase in the value of its imports of goods and services. What are the effect of these changes? So, first thing to notice is X minus M is our components of aggregate demand. If we have a fall in the level of X and we have an increase in the level of M, because they're components of AD, what do? That's going to move AD to the left, so it's going to make our aggregate demand fall. Okay, and now we just need to see how it will address the balance of payments. So remember that with the balance of payments, if our imports go up and our exports go down, what's it going to do? It's going to do one of either two things. It's going to increase an existing deficit on the balance of payments, or if we have a surplus, it's going to reduce an existing surplus on the balance of payments. Okay, opposite effect if we have the increase in exports. So therefore, what it's going to do is it's going to worsen the balance of payments, because our deficit will either get bigger or our surplus will reduce. Balance of payments would improve if we have an increase in exports and a decrease in imports, but that's not what's happening here. We're told that we have a decrease in the value of exports and an increase in the value of imports. Okay, 28, very simple. What is the equivalent of a country's national debt? National debt is the accumulated borrowing of a government, generally represented as a percentage of the national GDP. So national debt is normally given as a percentage of the GDP of a country. It's nothing to do with the difference between government spending and taxation. That would be a government budget, the revenue that they generate and the expenditure that they have. It's nothing to do with the interest paid by the government on the money that they owe. That is just the payments they have to make as part of the national debt. So when they borrow, they obviously have to make interest payments back to whoever they borrowed it from. And it's not the total money owed by all households in a country. That would be the level of household debt within the country. National debt is relating to the government because it's managed by the government. So it's the total amount that they borrow. (27) What would be classified as a supply side policy measure? So remember that a supply side policy measure is designed to move AS to the right. So it's designed to help us to increase our productive capacity or to help us become more productive. So imposition of a tariff on imported goods, what would that do? That would move our supply curve to the left. It's not a supply side policy measure, because it doesn't help us improve our productive capacity if we're restricting the number of imports that come into a market. Same with an open market sale of securities. That has nothing to do with a change in AD or AS. And a reduction in the government's fiscal deficit. Remember, fiscal policy is something that will change AD. So the fiscal deficit will be to do with the revenue and the expenditure that they're having. But because it's relating to AD, it's not going to be a supply side policy measure. Whereas a law to reduce the power of trade unions, what is that going to do? That's going to allow the industry to become more efficient, because what they're going to have with less power within trade unions is they're going to have less days off. So less days where workers are, for example, striking, which is where they'll refuse to work because they want to get better pay or better conditions. So it may allow us to become more productive because it's putting more power in the hands of the employer, essentially. And it's taking the power away from the trade unions, their collective bargaining that they'll use, and trying to get better pay and better working conditions for their employees. So it's going to allow for workers to be working for longer periods and therefore to become more productive. 26. Which measure is aimed directly at promoting international trade? Okay, so remember, international trade is allowing basically for the free movements of exports and imports, okay? So in this case, subsidies that are paid to export industries, that's going to directly promote international trade because it's going to allow us to export more. And assuming that we don't have any tariffs or quotas in place on imports, it may allow us to develop relationships or trade agreements with other countries as they become more reliant on our exports. So if we provide a subsidy in an industry like, let's say, electric cars in China, China can then export more electric cars to other countries, and as they become more reliant on those exports that we are sending to those countries, it may open up the opportunity for us to have trade agreements with them where we can import materials we need in China from those countries at cheaper prices than we may have been able to before the existence of a bilateral or multilateral trade agreement. Increasing interest rates, wage subsidies that are provided during recessions, and decreasing existing quotas, they're not going to be aimed directly at promoting international trade. So for the quotas, for example, decreasing existing quotas, that's actually going to decrease the amount that can be brought into the country, right? So a quota goes from 40 to 20. We're having an even stricter limit on the number of imports that we can bring in. And obviously if we're making the number of imports and come into a country stricter, then that's not going to really promote the free movement of exports and imports between a country. Same thing with wage subsidies and increasing interest rates. They're not going to have an effect on actually promoting international trade. They're not going to allow for the free movement of exports and imports. 25. Difficult enough question. So a country with a floating exchange rate experiences a large surplus on its current account of its balance of payments. Okay, so what is likely to decrease as a consequence of this? So first thing, if we start at the bottom, the value of a country's currency is not likely to depreciate or decrease. It's actually likely to appreciate. Okay, so what we have when we have a large surplus is it kind of creates an appreciation effect within the economy. And that appreciation effect, what I mean by that is that the price of our exports will go up, but the price of our imports will go down. So the same corresponding effect that we would have when we have an appreciation of the currency. Okay, therefore we can see the price of export capital from the country will actually go up, it won't go down. Now, if we have a large surplus, that's likely to mean that our AD has increased, right? So what can we make, or what kind of assumptions can we generate from that? AD increases, we can assume that our real GDP is increased, our national income has gone up, our living standards have gone up, and our level of employment has also gone up. So instead of the level of employment going down in the country, the level of employment would actually rise as a consequence of a large surplus on the current account. Whereas the price of imports into the country, we could see over here, they would go down. They would be a direct consequence of that large surplus due to the appreciation effect that would happen. 24. A country's currency has depreciated against the currencies of its main trading partners. How will the depreciation affect the terms of trade? Okay. First thing we need to understand is the effect of a depreciation. So the effect of a depreciation is that the price of the exports go down. It's the opposite of our appreciation. So assuming that the elasticity of the exports is elastic, the total revenue or the total exports would rise, whereas the price of imports would go up and the total imports would go down. Okay? Now, the second component of this is that we have to understand what the terms of trade is. And the terms of trade is the index of the export prices divided by the index of the import prices multiplied by 100. Right? So that's essentially it's the average price of the exports in comparison to the average price of the imports. So if we have a depreciation, we can see that the price of our exports will go down and the price of our imports will go up. So what's that going to do? That's actually going to make our terms of trade, our price or average price of exports in terms of the average price of imports, to worsen. So depreciation will make it worsen, and appreciation will actually make it improve. So A would be in the case that we had an appreciation. Terms of trade will not change. That would be if we didn't have a depreciation or appreciation in our currency. And terms of trade will worsen only if the depreciation causes inflation. That's not true. Irregardless of whether it causes inflation, by definition a depreciation will cause price of exports to go down and price of imports to go up. So it will worsen irregardless of inflation. (23) These questions are actually really simple. So I believe it was one of the 2024 papers, I can't remember the exact one, maybe it was the first one I did, which was QP11. They gave a much more difficult form of these comparative advantage questions. So remember, comparative advantage and specialization is basically which country can produce at the lower opportunity cost, and then once they calculate their lower opportunity cost, they're going to focus on specializing on that good or service. Okay, so in this example here, one thing to remember is that because it's a PPC, just because we specialize doesn't mean that we can actually increase the productive capability of what we decide to focus on, right? So in this case, we can see that for Japan is going to have a lower opportunity cost of producing tea because they only have to give up 2.5 rice in comparison to 3 rice for India. So Japan is going to focus on the tea, which will leave our output of tea at 200 units. Whereas for India has a lower opportunity cost of producing rice, because when they make 600 rice, they only have to give up 200 tea, whereas Japan has to make 500 rice to give up 200 tea. So India is going to focus on the production of rice. That's what they're going to specialize in. And that means that our output will be 600 rice and 200 tea. Okay, very straightforward question. You wouldn't even have to really calculate the comparative advantage for each country in order to get the correct answer here. Now, I haven't bothered to go through the opportunity cost, but it's basically just, it would be 1 rice is 1/3 of a tea. For Japan, tea is opportunity cost of producing 1 tea is 2.5 rice. Whereas for India, its opportunity cost of producing 1 tea is 3 rice. Okay, 21. So in the diagram, the intersection of AD and long-run aggregate supply at point X represent the current macroeconomic equilibrium. What point could represent the new equilibrium after the introduction of an increase in the retirement age? Okay, so we're starting here. Now we've got to identify, are we going to move to the left or are we going to move to the right in our long-run aggregate supply? Remember, this is relating to an increase or a decrease in the quantity and or quality of resources. So if we increase the retirement age, what's going to happen? We're going to increase our level of resources, because what's going to happen is that we're going to have a higher number of people in our workforce, or a higher number of people available to be employed as labor. Okay? Therefore, what we can see is that we can identify the only one that shifts to the right is to movement C here. But just to provide a bit of a further explanation, why does an increase in the retirement age here increase the general price level and result in a shift in AD? So not necessary for the question, but useful to understand anyway. If you think about it, if we've got more people working in an economy, we're going to have an increase in the national income level, right? Which can be represented here by where we were previously at with our real GDP to comparatively where we are now with our real GDP. What does that mean when our real GDP goes up? That means that national income will rise, right? And output will rise. So as we're making more goods and services, the national income level will increase. And when the national income level increases, the level of spending will also increase in the economy. Hence the reason why AD will move to the right. Consumer expenditure as a component of AD will increase there, which will mean that as we're spending more on goods and services, the price of those goods and services will increase. The graph gives the percentage unemployed for all people aged 16 and over, and for young people aged between 16 and 24. What is the consequence for consumer expenditure on products consumed by the 16 to 24 age group? So we're only looking at this one here from the period 2010 to 2020. Now, basically it's really easy to identify. This is the percentage unemployed. And like we gave in the previous question in 21, unemployment, national income and spending, they're all correlated, or they're all linked, right? The idea is that the higher the unemployment, that will equal the less expenditure on goods and services, right? If people have less money, less is going to be spent. And obviously that has the opposite effect then as well. So the lower the unemployment, the higher the expenditure on goods and services will be. So what we can see is that as the unemployment level is coming down here, what we would actually have is a increase during these periods on our expenditure for goods and services. Okay. And then towards 2019, 2020, as this is going up here, the unemployment level, so more people have no work, we would have a decrease in the expenditure on goods and services as less people have jobs. So what we can see happening is that we initially are having, from let's say 2010 to 2018, an increase in the expenditure on goods and services, and then a decrease in the expenditure on goods and services from 2018 to 2020. So a fall in consumer expenditure across the whole period, that's wrong because we've just shown it on our curve. We'll have an increase from 2010 to 2018. An initial fall in consumer expenditure followed by a rise, that's the opposite effect. We'll have an initial rise followed by a fall. So therefore C will be correct. And we don't have a rise in consumer expenditure across the whole period. We've just allayed or alluded to that on our curve. Okay, Diagram shows aggregate demand and aggregate supply for an economy. What changes in subsidies and indirect taxes would have caused the change from AS to AS1 to AS2? So we've moved to the left, right? Now what do we know about subsidies and indirect taxes? We know that indirect taxes will increase the cost of production, AS left. Subsidies will move it to the right because it decreases the cost of production. So what we're going to be looking for is we're going to be looking for an increase in our indirect taxes because we've moved left, and we're going to be looking for a decrease in our subsidies in order to cause the biggest possible shift to the left in AS. So higher subsidies and higher indirect taxes, depending on how much the subsidy provided is and the indirect taxes, that may just result in us staying at equilibrium. Higher subsidies would have an initial shift to the right, higher indirect taxes would have a shift back to the left. We may end up back at equilibrium. Higher subsidies and lower indirect taxes, okay, same thing, they would both result in a shift to the right, so we may end up somewhere around here in that case. Lower subsidies and higher indirect taxes, that would be correct. Lower subsidies will result in a shift to the left if the subsidies that were previously provided were quite high. As we take them away, the cost of production for the firms increases, and higher indirect taxes will shift it to the left straight away. So that would be represented by the graph that we're shown. And then the last one is obviously wrong. So lower subsidies and lower indirect taxes. Subsidies would be reduced. Yeah, fair enough. So we move left. But lower indirect taxes would mean we'd move back to the right as the taxes are being taken away and the price of the products start to decrease in the economy. Okay, 18 is very straightforward. So what statement explains why aggregate demand curve is downward sloping? So just draw an aggregate demand curve. What explains why? If I put in an initial price here, what do we see? Price of the product goes down, and remember what's represented down here is our real GDP, right? So as prices fall, the demand for exports becomes more elastic. No, that's not represented by an aggregate demand curve, right? We need to calculate the elasticity. As prices fall, fewer goods are imported. Again, no. As prices fall, we're going to have an increase in real GDP. As prices fall, the rate of interest will rise. Again, that depends. It's not shown, or it doesn't explain why AD curve is downward sloping. Some of these things may happen, but they're not explained just by the AD curve themselves, right? Whereas as prices fall, real wealth will rise, and so spending will increase. That is true because we see that we'll have a movement to the right in our real GDP, so we know that our spending is going to increase. And when the general price level, which is represented here on our vertical axis, falls, we know that the purchasing power of consumers will actually increase. Therefore, their wealth will also increase, because the money they would have had previously at point P is now going to be worth more at point P1. Okay, 17. Also very simple question. So which group is likely to suffer during high inflation? Borrowers. Okay, borrowers could suffer during high inflation. Importers may also suffer during high inflation. It's possible. As may producers. But the one that is most likely, which is our question, to suffer is the fixed wage earners, because they won't be able to recoup the loss from the inflation as their wages stay the same. The borrowers, depending on the rate of interest, they may suffer or they may benefit. So if the rate of interest that they have borrowed money at is lower than the rate of inflation, they're actually paying back less in real terms, so they may benefit in that case. Same with importers and producers. Depending on certain circumstances, they may benefit, but remember that they can change the prices that they're paying for or switch to other countries, for example, for their imported goods. Whereas the fixed wage earners, they are the most susceptible or the most likely to suffer because they can't really make any changes. They're receiving an income and the price level is increasing. They are 100% vulnerable to the inflation. Table shows the income and wealth of Jasmine. What is the value of Yasmin's wealth? Okay, so we just need to identify here what's income and what is wealth, right? Children's welfare benefits is income because it's something that's received from the government. Remember that our definition of disposable income is like the gross salary or the gross wages that you're getting minus the tax that you pay plus the benefits that you receive from the government. Dividends from shares is also income because it's money that, or it's regular money that's paid to us from the investment into a company. Property owned is wealth. Savings in the bank is wealth, and shares is wealth. Wages is also income. Remember that income is something that we receive on a regular basis. Wealth can be assets that we hold, right? So shares are assets that we're going to hold. They're a percentage holding in a firm. Savings in a bank are assets that we hold. They're just cash value assets. And property, again, the percentage of the equity that we own in a property will be the wealth that we hold in it. So therefore, Yasmin's wealth is going to be 43,000, property owned 40,000, plus the 1,000 from savings, plus the 2,000 from shares. Question 15. Which statement correctly describes absolute advantage? So remember, absolute advantage is relating to what? It's a bit different from our comparative advantage. It's just relating to the total output that they can produce, right? Whereas comparative advantage is which country can produce at a lower opportunity cost. Therefore, our correct answer is D, and we can get that just from knowing its output. It's when a country's output of a good is greater per unit of resource than another country. Okay, so we can produce more with, let's say, one factor of resource input in comparison to another country, whereas the comparative advantage will be, can we produce at a lower opportunity cost than the other country? So A doesn't apply. Comparative advantage would be lower opportunity cost. It's nothing to do with the wage costs, and it's nothing to do with the relative price of exports to relative price of imports. That would be our terms of trade. So just definition of it will allow you to get that answer. Question 14. Demand supply. Government fixes a maximum price. What would happen? Okay. So this may seem like a very difficult question, but it's actually really easy once we notice the mistake that's been made. What have they done here? A maximum price should be put below the equilibrium, right? But in this case it hasn't. The maximum price has been put above the equilibrium. So what does that mean? That means that we're going to continue to operate in the economy at the current equilibrium. Okay, because the maximum price is not going to have any effect. So the maximum price may not even be there at any, it may not even have been, or it should not have been implemented above equilibrium because it's not going to have any effect. We're still going to have our current equilibrium price where demand meets supply operating in the market. Therefore, if we look at this, consumers would have to be rationed. No, they won't, because we'll still operate at equilibrium. Government wouldn't have to introduce a subsidy because we'll still operate at equilibrium. Supply of quantity OQ2 would be guaranteed. No, because again we'll only operate at equilibrium, so the supply of OQ could be guaranteed but not OQ2, because the maximum price should have been placed below equilibrium. So therefore what would happen is that the market equilibrium quantity OQ would be demanded and supplied, which is where we would stay at our equilibrium, hence why it is correct, due to the ineffectiveness of the maximum price being placed above equilibrium. Remember, maximum price has to be below and minimum price has to be above, but they've told us they put a maximum price on it. Question 13. Demand for medical face masks exceeds supply during a disease outbreak. What is the most likely cause of this excess demand? Okay, very similar to the question that was below. Some consumers do not have effective demand. No. That may be true. Some consumers will always not have effective demand because they may not be able to afford it, right? But that's not going to result in or it's not going to cause or explain the reason why we have excess demand. Demand for medical face masks is price inelastic in the short run. Okay, again, that may be true, but once again, it doesn't explain why we would have excess demand for face masks exceeding our level of supply. Price of face masks is fixed below the equilibrium price. That would explain it, because if we draw what have they done? They have done exactly what they've given you in the previous question. They've just done it correctly this time, which is where we would impose a maximum price. So we have our price here in equilibrium where demand equals supply, and the only reasonable explanation for having an excess or a creation of excess demand or a shortage is that we've put in a maximum price here below the equilibrium, which creates a significant contraction in demand and a significant contraction in supply and a significant extension in demand. So Q1 to Q2 would be the area of our shortage, or in other words, our excess demand. A specific tax is placed on sales of bottles of lemonade. In the diagram, S is the supply curve before the imposition of the tax and S1 is the supply curve after the tax. Which distance represents the specific tax? Okay, so 2024 we went through this again and we said this time they're asking us for the full area of the tax, right? And we said in class the easiest way to calculate this is we take our new equilibrium price and we just take it down to where we hit the original supply, okay? And that will show us the full area of the tax, right? So the full incidence of the tax here will be WT, right? WU, that will be the burden on the consumer. So remember, the burden on the consumer changes depending on the elasticity, but it's calculated from taking the new price down to where we would have hit the old price, matching up with the new quantity of supply. So the burden on the consumer would be this area in here, and the burden on the producer is just the area that's left. So UT would be the burden on the producer. WX doesn't apply because once we shift, that area becomes irrelevant when it comes to calculating the tax. Diagram shows the demand and supply curves for solar energy in India. Initial equilibrium is X. Government increases the subsidy to solar energy producers. At the same time, there is a rise in alternative sources of energy. Okay, so if we increase the subsidy, what's that going to do? That's going to shift our supply curve to the right. Okay, so we're going to be starting at X and then we're going to be here. Okay, always follow it one change at a time. Now, if there is a rise in the price of alternative uses of energy, that's going to decrease the demand for the alternative uses of energy, but it's going to increase the demand for our use of energy, which is the solar energy, because they're going to be substitutes for us. So our demand will have to shift to the right after we shift to the right with supply, and we'll end up at point B. Okay, this is a difficult question. You have to pay really close attention to get this question. So, golf club membership fees in Singapore have risen as a result of restrictions on travel to cheaper golf courses in neighbouring countries and the closure of some local golf courses. Equilibrium of X, which point shows the result of these changes? We see demand and supply are changing here. We start at X. If we take the closure of local golf courses, that's going to reduce the supply of golf courses that are available in Singapore, right? So we're going to move from X to point A. But if we look at the result of restrictions on travel to cheaper golf courses in neighbouring countries, it now becomes harder for people in Singapore to take their golfing holidays in other countries. So what are they going to do? They're going to be forced to stay in Singapore, which means that the demand for golf in Singapore will go up due to the government restrictions that have taken place on travelling to other countries. So we need to also have a corresponding shift to the right in demand, which means that we're going to end up at a new equilibrium of point B. Nine is very straightforward. In which situation is the demand for a product said to be price elastic? Okay, remember, elastic means that our demand changes by a greater percentage than the change in price. Okay, that's what elastic means. Our value is more than 1.00. So demand will always be changing by more than the price. So, quantity demand responds to a change in price. That doesn't tell us if it's elastic or inelastic. Okay, that's just showing us the nature of QD responding to a change in price. Increase in price brings about a decrease in quantity demanded. That shows us the nature of the relationship between demand and price. It doesn't tell us the extent of the change, which is what elastic and inelastic tells us. Increase in price induces consumers to spend more on the product. Well, that's just false. An increase in price is going to reduce the quantity demanded, but again, it doesn't tell us anything about it being elastic. But if we have a decrease in price brings about an increase in revenue, that is true. Because what we know about elastic is that when the price goes down, because the quantity demanded will change, the quantity demanded is going to go up by more than the change in price, which means that our total revenue or total expenditure on the product is going to increase when we reduce the price of the product. Question 8. Diagram shows the European market for diesel fuel. Original equilibrium is M. Which area shows the new producer surplus after we've had a shift to D2? Okay, so first thing is, what is the producer surplus? Like I said in class before, the easy way to think about it, right, because they don't ask us complicated questions on this, is it is the area below the price to the bottom of the supply curve. Okay, so therefore before the change, our producer surplus would be equilibrium price I'm talking about there, GMJ That would be our area of producer surplus before the change. But after the change, because of the shift we've had, we would move to a new equilibrium price of N. So this would be our new producer surplus, and the full area, including the old, would be our old producer surplus. So our new area would be HNJ, JHN. Okay, the price of a good is $2, quantity supplied is 100k, price elasticity of supply is 0.8 in the short run, 1.4 in the long run. Price of the good increases to 220. What is the increase in the quantity supplied of good X between the short run and long run? So we've got to take away, we've got to calculate it for the short run and calculate it for the long run and then take it away. The first thing we need to do is we need to calculate our price change. So 220 minus 2, that will give us a 0.20 price change. 0.20 divided by 2.00 will give us a 10% change in price. Okay, now if our quantity, or if our PES is 0.8 in the short run, that tells us that in the short run, our quantity supplied must have been an 8% increase, right? So 8% of 100k will be 108k. And in the long run, because our PES is 1.4 and our price change here is 10% that we've calculated already, we know that the quantity supplied must have increased by 14%. So in the long run, our quantity supplied will be 114k. So what is the change between the short run and the long run? It's 114k minus 108k, which is 6,000. Question 6, very simple again, just another definition question. What does consumer surplus measure? Consumer surplus measures the consumer's gain from purchasing a good at a price below what they are willing to pay. So remember that consumer surplus is the opposite of our producer surplus. It is the area, I may as well bring this up to show it. It is the area above the equilibrium price to the top of the demand curve, right? So it's, in other words, the area between what they're paying to what they would be willing to pay for the product. Hence the reason why we call it the surplus or the gain that they have. Because we only have to pay this much in the market for the product, but we're willing to pay all the way up to here. Okay, so it's nothing to do with marginal gains or marginal cost, etc. It's nothing to do with opportunity cost, and it's nothing to do with the producer at all. Consumer surplus is only concerned with the consumer. Producer surplus is, so this is like the area that the producer is gaining because they're willing to supply at certain levels the product at a price all the way down here, but they're receiving this price in the market for the product. Question 5. Which row correctly describes the relationship between two goods implied by the value? Okay, so the thing to remember here is, if it's a plus, this is XED, right? Cross elasticity demand. A plus indicates that they're substitutes, and a negative value indicates that they are complements. Okay, now in general, the strength of the relationship is dictated by whether they are bigger or smaller than 1.00. Okay, so in the case that we have a figure that's plus, let's say it's plus 1.5, okay, that would be a strong substitute product. Minus 1.5 would be a strong complementary product. Therefore, something like plus 0.7, we'll say, they would be weak substitutes. They still have the plus figure, so they're still substitutes, but they're weak because they're less than 1.00, whereas minus 0.7 would indicate a weak complementary relationship. Because again, they still have the negative figure to show that it's a complement, but they're less than 1.00. So from those explanations, we can match it up and we can see weak complements, no, they would be strong complements. Weak substitutes, no. First of all, it's a negative, so it would be a complement, not a substitute. Weak substitutes, yes, 0.0, 0.5. Plus 2.0, they would not be strong complements, they would be strong substitutes. Question 4, we're nearly there. Feels like a very long video, this one. My head is going to explode. Factory manufactures chairs. The manufacturing process is divided into a number of tasks. What is the likely disadvantage of this division of labor? Okay, this is very simple. Disadvantage of division of labor is a decrease in motivation. Employees become bored as they get focused on only doing one or a particular task every single day. So it becomes repetitive and boring for the employees. Everything else that's offered here, a decrease in output, it's the opposite effect. Division of labor, an advantage of division of labor is an increase in output, an increase, not a decrease in productivity, and an increase in the quality of the final product, not a decrease in the quality of the final product. Okay, as they get focused on a certain task, they start to become more productive because they're doing the task every day, so by nature they would get better at it. The output would therefore increase and the quality of the product would increase, again due to the skills and the experience they're gaining means they would become better at making the product. 3. Diagram shows the change in a country's PPC from XX to YY. What would explain the change? Okay, so first of all, we can see what's happening here. We have increased our capability to produce food, right? We've moved from XX to YY, but we have decreased our capability to produce drink. Now, why are we saying increase and decrease the capability? Because this is a shift in the PPC. So the way to explain it is what we possibly have had is we've possibly had an increase in the quality and or quantity of resources to make food, but we've had a decrease in the quantity and or the quality of resources to make drinks. Hence the reason why with the same level of resources we can now make less drinks, but we can now make more food, right? So consumers chose to consume more food and drink? No. The consumers choosing would result in a reallocation of resources. So it would result in a movement along the PPC from, let's say, point A to point B. Not necessarily a shift. A shift is a change in the productive capabilities. Government taxes has nothing to do with PPC. Productivity rose in food production and fell in drink production. Well, yeah, we can see that's correct because we just explained about the quantity and quality of resources. And then imports and exports had nothing to do with a PPC either. Hospital Management Board decides to reallocate 800k from its 1.2 million new buildings budget to spend on healthcare. What's the opportunity cost decision? Okay. So remember, opportunity cost is what we are giving up, right? What are we giving up in this case? We're giving up the loss of new buildings because this 800k was being reallocated, which means it would have been spent on buildings. So that's what we have lost, right? Now just to explain, A and B would not be the correct answer here because they are monetary losses, right? And unless they specifically tell us for the monetary loss, or they don't give us options for A, B, C, and D, which would be the opposite effects of the monetary losses, then they're not going to be the correct answer. Cost of healthcare for cancer patients will be a consequence of the decision, not an opportunity cost. It's not something we've lost out on. Cost of 800, like we said, that would be the monetary opportunity cost, not the opportunity cost itself. And 400k is nothing to do with it at all, because it's 800k that has been given up. And finally, last question. What is a produced means of further production? Straightforward. This is capital. Capital is used to make, or to help us to make, other goods and services. It's illustrated by, if we take it back to the PPC, so if we have capital goods and consumer goods, we can reallocate resources from consumer goods to capital goods. So let's say in the short run we're at A, and then we move to producing at B. So we start to make less consumer goods and more capital goods. This would be in the short run. Then over the long run, what we're able to do is we're able to actually create a shift in our productive capability of the PPC due to reallocating more resources to capital. Therefore, capital is something that allows us to make more. It's a means of further production. Whereas enterprise, labor, and land, they are not something we produce which allow us to make more of something else. That is only capital. Illustrated through the PPC, also illustrated through the factors of production definition that you can check out in your Unit 1 slides and revision notes. Okay, thanks for listening.